Hail, adventurers, and welcome back to Doom Swords. I trust your journeys into the wilds were most fruitful. Here we have been quite busy, for such is the time of year. It brings with it good, and it brings with it bad. But we're still here. Once you have enjoyed the fruits of your labor, and rested a bit, please join me as I continue to tell the tale of advanced Dungeons & Dragons combat on this, the latest episode of Doom's Words. All right, guys, welcome back. It's been a little while. We're continuing our series on Advanced Dungeons & Dragons combat, rules as written specifically, and I appreciate everyone who's tagged along for the ride. I feel like I should give a little bit of background on the series for anyone who's catching this video and hasn't seen any of the other ones. This is actually the third part of the series. This is the fourth video, but the third part. That's because the second part was split into two segments, two separate videos at any rate. So the first part was basically just some talking about why I decided to make this series, and what the objectives were, and some philosophical blathering about AD&D and rules as written. And it's worth checking out. You know, if you don't watch that, you're not going to miss anything critical or anything necessary to future episodes, including this one. Part 2 was sort of based on a document that I created so that we could define some terms and definitions that we would need moving forward. This was particularly designed for those people who maybe never encountered AD&D or maybe needed a bit of a refresher on what some of the things meant. So surprisingly to me, I got a number of comments, and it was all over the place really, that pointed out that some of the stuff in that basic terms and definitions document showed them things that they had not previously been aware of. So that was good. It was great. This third part of the series is a little bit different. There is going to be some reading involved. I know that's not probably particularly exciting to a lot of people, but it's necessary for the second half of this video. So what's been done is my good friend, my dear friend, Cooley, probably the only person who's insane enough to talk to me at length about minutia in AD&D, particularly those things that other people have already discussed amongst themselves or on online forums or whatever for the last 20 years and are dead set in their ways, have tired of discussing. This guy sticks around and talks about all of it to me. He actually cares about AD&D deeply, and the second half of this video is going to be going through a software program I wrote to simulate out some of these neglected rules or unknown rules or whatever in Raw to determine whether or not they really make a difference for your game and whether or not that difference is something that you're willing to embrace. So thank you, Cool. I appreciate it very much. So a little bit, I feel like I should say a little bit about how this and probably future videos are going to differ from the prior ones. I've discovered that it's really difficult for me to get an hour or so of time for whatever reason. For me to get an hour or so of time without being interrupted. In fact, the recording of this part has been interrupted 3 times, I think. sometimes as deeply as an hour in. And I don't like to script these videos. I mean, obviously reading is kind of a form of scripting, but I don't like to script the videos. I don't like to cut the videos and all that kind of stuff. I feel like that takes away from the organic approach that I want to take to making these. I really like to try to present this as if I'm talking to you directly, but necessity has made it to where I've it's I'm going to have to in order to get these out more quickly, which I definitely want to do. I'm going to have to. It's become obvious that I'm going to have to record smaller pieces because I can find 5-10 minutes at a time, generally pretty easily. I'm going to have to record smaller pieces and kind of splice them together to make the video. And I'll put in a little transition or something like that. So that's a little bit different from the format that we're accustomed to. But I think that it's going to help get them out more quickly, because it's much easier to dedicate a short amount of time right now than it is to dedicate a long amount of time. So with this particular video, we're going to move into something a bit different. Okay, so the first half of it is going to be looking at what the Dungeon Master's Guide specifically says. It's his kind of a deep dive into some of the most contentious rules and the things that are part of Raw that people don't generally follow. And when we're going to look at what the Dungeon Master's Guide says about that, and in order to make things a bit easier and to condense it and put it all in a single document, I've simply copy and pasted, and I'll provide commentary where necessary. I don't expect that to take a tremendous amount of time, but you never know, because I can get a little bit talkative. And some of this stuff, we're going to be dealing with high Gygaxian, which in some cases is high Confusaxian, but it is what it is. The second half of this video, we're going to go ahead and take a look at that combat simulation application, and really try to nail down the statistical probabilities that change and the effects that they have on the game when you use some or all of these rules that people typically ignore together. So I hope you enjoy. I hope it's not boring, and I hope you find it as fascinating as I do, honestly, because putting together this application, even though I've used many of these rules, if not all of them together, for a very long time, the application was surprising to me in a number of ways. So thanks for watching, and let's get right on with it. All right, so let's get to reading. As mentioned previously, this document has been created from text in the DMG related specifically to the things that we need to know in order to view the combat simulator in the correct light. And that starts with surprise segments. So surprise is determined by rolling a 6-sided die for each party concerned, modifying the result by using the most favorable member of the party concerned, i.e. a ranger surprised only on a roll of 1 will represent the whole of a group of other character types. The same holds true for mixed types of monsters. Surprise is usually expressed as a 2 in 6 chance for all parties concerned, i.e. a 6-sided die is rolled with a 1 or 2 indicating surprise. Some monsters are more capable of surprising foes than the normal 2 in 6 probability, and some cannot be surprised as easily, so they have a reduced probability, 1 in 6, 1 in 8, etc. Each one of surprise equals 1 segment, 6 segments of time lost to the surprised party, and during the lost time, the surprising party can freely act to escape or attack or whatever. If both parties are surprised, then the effect is negated or reduced. If surprise is indicated for both parties concerned, the party which has lesser surprise subtracts its result from the result of the greater to find the number of segments the latter are inactive. Nonetheless, it is possible for both parties to be surprised and equally, with surprise thus having no effect. Okay, I added a little note here because it's important. Higher rolls for surprise, as long as they indicate surprise, are worse than lower rolls are. Now, that might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but when taken in the context of something that AD&D does well, That is that a single die roll often serves multiple purposes. It makes a little bit more sense. So the single die roll indicates whether or not you are surprised, and indicates for how long you are surprised. And AD&D does this in a lot of places, and it does it well. So as long as you look at it in from that perspective, it starts to make a little more sense. So there's a couple of things that we need to unpack in the previous few paragraphs. Okay, so to simplify things, we roll 1d6 for each party, modifying the result by the member who's surprised least often. Okay, if dice other than a d6 are used, because they mention your 1 in 6, 1 in 8. I think there's the 1 in 20 out there, and that stuff. If dice other than a d6 are used, there's a procedure for handling that, and generally it involves converting into percentages and making the comparison from there. It's kind of out of scope for this, but it's worth mentioning, and that's something that we'll certainly get into later. So another thing to keep in mind is that the number on the die indicates the number of surprise segments. So if you have standard chances of surprise or standard probability 1 through 2 on a d6, you roll a 2, you're surprised for 2 segments. If your chance of being surprised is 1 in 4 on a d6, you roll a 4, you're surprised for 4 segments. Now, there's been a little back and forth on this over time, and there's a couple of camps on it, but I tend to hew as close to the DMG's actual text, and anything that's in the player's handbook as well. I tend to cut real close to that because that's what the whole purpose of rules as written are. But some of that sort of disagreement with the number on the die representing the total number of segments comes from the term surprise and complete surprise. Now, you'll find these in a couple of places in the DMG. You might also find it in the player's handbook, but I know there's 3 or 4, maybe even more places in the DMG. You'll find it in the monster manual too, and in a few of the monsters that reference surprise and complete surprise. Okay, that concept comes from Eldritch Wizardry way back in the day, where surprise was 1 segment, complete surprise was 2 segments. So some people have taken that to mean that in AD&D, which is a different game system, the maximum number of segments of surprise is 2, because that's as far as complete surprise goes. But there's plenty of text in the DMG that contradicts that. The inclusion of surprise and complete surprise was probably just hastily put together and thrown in and not edited out. You're more than welcome, if you want to limit surprise to 2 segments, but that also means that if a creature can surprise more often than a 1 and 2, you're not really giving him the full breadth of his ability to wreak havoc on his opponent. So if surprise and complete surprise are useful in the context of the rules and wherever you find them in any of the rule books, my suggestion would simply be that anything beyond 2 segments of surprise, equal to or beyond 2 segments of surprise, would count as complete surprise. 1 segment would count as surprise. Okay. So if both parties are surprised unequally, okay, and this is really important, what we do is we take the values of their surprise dice, and we subtract the lesser surprised from the greater surprised in order to determine how many segments the greater surprised is surprised for. So as an example, say we have 2 groups, we're going to call them Group A and Group B. Okay, they have standard probabilities of being surprised. Group A rolls a 1, so he's surprised. Group B, surprised for 1 segment specifically. Group B rolls a 2, so they're surprised for 2 segments. Okay, 2 segments is obviously worse, so they've gotten the worst of the results. Okay, so we're going to subtract the 1 of Group A from the 2 of Group B, which yields a net result of 1 segment of surprise for Group B. Now, of course, you can look at this however you want. You can say that that first segment of surprise just doesn't exist, and only the single segment of surprise for group B is of any sort of consequence. It's really a flavor thing. A couple of groups come around the corner, encounter each other, and Group A is not surprised at all. They get the jump on Group B, and Group B is surprised for a single segment, or it might be something like, they come around the corner, they're both caught completely unawares and flat-footed. Group A gets its act together more quickly than Group B does, but Group A still stands there relatively motionless and assessing the situation for 6 seconds. Sorry. So it's really just a matter of flavor and how you want to handle that. But the important part of it is that we subtract the die from the other die only when surprise is unequal. Okay, when there's a variation between the values presented on the opponent's dice. In the situation where surprise is equal, you can do it the same way. You can say that, hey, everyone's unaware and trying to figure out what's going on for the period of time shown on the shared surprise results, or you can just skip that entirely and move directly to combat. But the end result of tied surprise is that there's no surprise at all, at least not surprise that allows anyone to do anything with anyone else being unable to react. Something that's not mentioned here, which is also important, is that we talked about if a member of the group is capable of being surprised less often, then that ability is afforded to the group as a whole. Okay, so say Ranger is only surprised on a 1 and a 1d6. That Ranger, if he's with your group, okay, means that your entire group is only capable of being surprised on a 1 and 1d6. So that's a valuable addition to the adventuring party, obviously. Now, the same is not true for a member of the group that's capable of surprising an enemy more often. Okay, and that's not explicitly stated in the DMG, but and at least not that I can remember. Okay, and not that I can find with some fairly deep digging. It's perfectly logical that they're not, right? Because just because you're capable of surprising opponent more often due to stealth or some sort of innate special ability does not mean that everyone else clanking along in armor and all that kind of stuff is capable of doing the same thing. But we can actually refer to the player's handbook or other sources such as the monster manual. Player's handbook being the most valuable of the sources. In this case, we can refer to the player's handbook. We can look at elves, we can look at halflings, we can look at rangers, and these individuals have to either travel with their own kind in order to be able to surprise more often, or they have to be an advanced scout. There might be some other restrictions, can't be wearing metal armor, something of that nature. So that's kind of where that rule comes from. It's really just important to remember if somebody is capable of surprising more often, then the entire group is the entire group still functions as if they're able to surprise normally. An example would be from the monster manual would be a huge spider, right? So you got a huge spider, surprises on a 5 and 6. If he's surrounded by a bunch of kobolds in his lair who feed him or are food for him or whatever, just because the huge spider is capable of surprising on a 5 and 6, the kobolds are not. The kobolds are capable of their standard surprise probability of 2 and 6. Okay, because the party surprised is relatively inactive, the surprising party will be able to attempt telling blows during each segment of surprise as if the segment were an entire round. That is, a fighter able to attack twice during a normal round of combat will be able to do so twice during each surprise segment, so dice are rolled for hit determination accordingly. Even if distance prevents striking with weapons, the discharge of arrows, bolts, or hand-hurled weapons is permissible at 3 times the normal rate, providing the weapon missiles are ready. Otherwise, at normal rates for rounds. Once surprise segments are over, melee proceeds normally on a round-by-round basis. All right, so this one is one of those ones that's been argued to the ends of earth and back. right? And uh, there's a lot of reason for that. Okay, uh, proponents, of which there are a few, simply handle it as if it's a part of the rules and move on with their lives, right? And detractors often will point to the extremes, okay, to sort of show the absurdity of the concept. And if you look at the concept at face value, it seems to be extreme, right? So let's take an example. Let's say we've got a lone ranger hiding in the woods, right? An adventuring party comes upon him. This particular ranger, for whatever reason, decides to fire on these opponents. The ranger is capable of surprising on a 4 and 6. If the opposing party rolls a 4, then they're going to be surprised for 4 segments. The normal rate of fire for a bow is 2 per round, right? 2 arrows per round. What this means is that the ranger will be able to fire 6 arrows per segment, 3 times the normal rate of 2, and he's going to be able to do that for 4 segments. This means he's going to be able to fire 24 arrows during those 4 segments of surprise. Okay, now that's an extreme. The probability of that happening is very slim, but it's something that people point to. And when you look at it that way, it does seem, being able to fire 24 arrows in 24 seconds isn't very realistic. But there's a couple of things that we can think about that maybe makes it seem a little less extreme or absurd, right? Number one, just because a segment is 6 seconds, doesn't and it fit within the rules of surprise, it doesn't really necessarily mean that 6 seconds has passed, right? It was a convenient insertion because we already had that time period defined for us, just like we had rounds and turns defined. It was a convenient insertion for surprise. So maybe you look at it like a segment is really just a sort of a zoomed in round that it takes a variable amount of seconds to resolve. Seconds aren't really important in the context of timekeeping, and that it kind of represents the idea of your life flashing before your eyes if you're on the receiving end of surprise. Another thing that we can think about, like I already mentioned, is that it's not going to happen very often. Okay, and if it does, we're going to have to look, and we'll see shortly whether or not that's really a game changer, given the reduced probability of something like that happening. If we look at the aforementioned huge spider, capable of surprising 5 and 6, and a hapless group of adventurers runs into its lair, and then these huge spiders are generally what, trapdoor spiders or or jumping spiders, those sorts of creatures. The party might be surprised for 5 segments, and the huge spider might be able to attack 5 times. He doesn't use ranged weapons, but he uses melee weapons, and you could think that even being able to attack with a melee weapon or natural weaponry once per segment is likewise extreme. But again, I don't find it to be particularly game breaking. Another thing that we can look at with regard to weapons, missile weapons specifically, is that the 3 times rate of fire. So the ranger that we talked about, who surprises opponents on a 4 and 6, and his opponents happen to get the worst possible result that they can get of 4 segments, means that ranger can fire 24 arrows. Does he have 24 arrows? Probably not. Okay, let's say you've got a standard quiver holding 12 arrows. He would have to have 2 quivers, right? Which leads us into the next point. The next point is the key word here is ready. So what ready means is not defined here. See, the ranged or missile weapons have to be at the ready. Ready is not defined here, and that's up to the determination of the individual DM. So you might say, okay, well, the ranger has his quiver of arrows. He's got a bunch of arrows, and he's got an arrow that's knocked and ready to fire. So maybe that's the only. Maybe he doesn't get 3 times the normal rate because the others aren't ready. Now, maybe on the other hand, the ranger is completely prepared. He's standing there in the set of woods. He knows somebody's coming along. He's got his arrows sticking in the ground or laying somewhere where he can just easily grab them and draw back his bow and fire them off. Then maybe that changes things. Same thing with daggers, for example, because hand hurled weapons operate the same way. If you can throw 3 daggers or darts, provided that they're ready and or 6 rather, 3 in a standard combat segment, then how many are you going to have available to you? You're certainly not going to have ready 12 daggers in your hands. Okay, you're gonna have to you're gonna have to grab them and throw them and that sort of thing. So it's really, in my opinion, it's much ado about nothing, and I think it adds some dynamic nature to the combat, and I think it's a good rule. Could it be refined? It most certainly could. It could be changed in a way that ends up making more sense or whatever, but I do not, by and large, think that it's broken, and I do think that it should be used. Well, what's good for the opponents of the PCs tends to be good for the PCs as well, and vice versa. So that's really all I specifically have to say about that part. But there are most people don't use that at all. So if you choose not to use it, that's absolutely your prerogative. I do choose to use it, and the combat simulator has been designed to take that into account when we simulate these results. So dexterity, reaction, and surprise. This factor affects both surprise and mutual surprise situations. In the former case, the penalty, which is -3 to -1, or bonus, which will be +1 to +3, and this is on the standard scale, of course, of 3 to 18 dexterity score, allows the surprised party on an individual basis only the opportunity to mitigate the condition. That is, if there's a dexterity penalty, the individual will suffer that many additional segments of time in a surprise state. On the other hand, if the dexterity bonus applies, the individual negates that many segments of surprise as far as the individual only is concerned. Dexterity reaction bonus for surprise never creates surprise in an opponent party or in an individual with regard to its penalty factor. It adds to existing surprise or detracts from it, and only as far as the particular individual is concerned, not for any other individuals concerned. Now, as DM, you'll undoubtedly decide that there are situations where penalty and or bonus do not apply, such as when an individual is otherwise prepared, or when the individual is in the act of pulling chainmail over his or her head, which that's interestingly specific. But such adjudication is properly within the scope of refereeing the game, and you should feel free to deny either case as you see fit. I added a note here, okay, that the PHB indicates that dexterity, reaction, and attacking bonuses only apply if the creature is unencumbered. I believe it's, for a human, that would be movement rate 12, but there's a nice little table or chart on page 101 to 102 of the PHB that discusses the reaction of the various encumbrance levels. There's nothing specific in the DMG that talks about this with regard to dexterity, reaction, and surprise, or anything related to the same in initiative. But the PHB is what we have to go on. And since none of that is superseded by anything in the DMG, that's what I use. That's raw to me. Okay. So the dexterity reaction in surprise only applies, okay, if you're unencumbered, if it's a bonus. If it's a penalty, okay, of course it continues to apply. If you're more weighted down, your penalty, logically might even be worse. Okay. Um, and also the other thing that you want to remember, that's really critically important, is that dexterity penalty or bonus never creates surprise. Surprise has to exist first, and then the amount of surprise is adjusted from there. Initiative. Okay, so surprise gives initiative to the non or less surprised party. It is otherwise determined when an encounter occurs and at the start of each combat round. It indicates which of the two parties will act, react. Again, a d6 is rolled and the score for the two parties are compared. It is recommended that such initiative rolls be made openly unless there is some reason to hide that of the encountered monster party, such as special bonuses which would be unknown to the player characters involved. The higher of the two rolls is said to possess the initiative for that melee round. While it's not accurate to roll one die for all individuals comprising each party, it is convenient and a necessary expedient. Separate rolls could be made for each member of two small groups, for instance, but what happens to this simple, brief determination if one party consists of 9 characters and 6 henchmen, and the other of 7 giants and 19 dire wolves, let us say? Possession of initiative allows the individuals to take action or reaction as desired according to the actions available to them. The dexterity or speed of individuals or weapons is not considered in the 1 minute round, except as hereafter noted. I think that's pretty straightforward. I'm just checking to see if I put in any notes for anything that I need to address in that section specifically. One thing it does mention that if you lose, if you're surprised, then initiative is automatically granted to the other party. So it's if it's helpful to formulate it in your mind, you can kind of think of surprise or surprise segments as initiative rounds where the non-surprised group has automatically won and the surprised group has no ability to counterattack. That's essentially what surprise segments are, and with the time scale being zoomed into. So initiative for creatures with multiple attack routines. Remember, we talked about attack routines in the second part of part 2. I think it might have been the first, but regardless, we talked about it, and it's an important concept. So when one or more creatures involved in combat are permitted to use their attack routines twice or more often during the round, then the following initiative determinants are employed. When the attack routine may be used twice, then allow the side with this advantage to attack first and last with those members of its group who have this advantage. If it's possessed by both parties, the initiative roll determines which group strikes first and third, which group strikes second and last. If one or both groups have members only or allowed only one attack routine, it will always fall in the middle of the other attacks, the order determined by dicing for initiative when necessary. If one party has the ability to employ its attack routines thrice, then the other party dices for initiative to see if it or the multi-routine group strikes first in the midpoint of the round. Extrapolate for routines which occur 4 or more times in a round by following the method above. Note that a routine, this goes back to attack routines, is the attack or attacks usual to the creature concerned, i.e. a weapon or weapons for a character, a claw bite routine for a bear with incidental damage assessed as it occurs, the hug, for example. A 12th level fighter is allowed attack routines twice in every odd numbered melee round, for example, and this moves up to 3 per round if a haste spell is cast upon the fighter. Damage from successful attacks is assessed when the hit score is made and damage determined. The creature so taking damage having to survive it in order to follow its attack routine. Okay. One thing we should mention here, and we talked about it before. So attack routines, if there's any confusion about that an attack routine is the normal attacks that you make in a single attack with a melee weapon or natural weaponry. So again, claw bite. A chimera with claw bite horn, claw bite horn. I think, the 6 attacks, that's an attack routine. Claw, bite is an attack routine. A fighter attacking with a long sword is an attack routine. A fighter dual wielding a long sword and a short sword is an attack routine. Okay. So it's important to differentiate between attack routines and attacks. So when you're afforded multiple attacks as a 12th level fighter, for example, if you're a dual wielding fighter, that might mean that you attack first and third with both of those weapons, because that comprises the totality of your attack routine. Dexterity, penalty, and bonus considerations. So remember, we talked about dexterity not affecting initiative except under certain circumstances. Well, this would be that circumstance. The dexterity attacking adjustment is for missile firing considerations when initiative is considered. It adjusts the initiative die roll for the concerned individual only. Thus, it may well allow the concerned individual to discharge a missile prior to the opponent's attack, even though the opponent has gained the initiative otherwise, or vice versa. More important, this factor also gives the individual a to-hit penalty or bonus when discharging a missile at an opponent. I would say that it's arguable whether or not that's, a to-hit penalty or bonus is more important than being able to fire first. But what I will say is that I see a lot of DMs, and this is a holdover from the old days, and it's also introduced by some of the ambiguity in the text of the Dungeon Master's Guide, specifically related to combat sequence. A lot of DMs will disregard initiative entirely and say that whatever the initiative result, anybody who's firing missile weapons, that happens first. Okay. But according to Raw, it doesn't. If you win initiative, yeah, you fire first and last because your rate of fire is 2. If you lose initiative, you don't fire first and last because your rate of fire is 2. You fire first and last based on the initiative that you rolled. And if that happens to be a losing initiative and you're facing another archer or missile using creature that has a rate of fire more than 1, that creature gets to fire first and last against you, with your attacks falling in between. Once again, this dexterity, penalty, and bonus consideration only applies if you're unencumbered. So if you're not dealing with a character who's unencumbered, you can basically disregard this. Okay, and unencumbered means carrying up to, we can reference the player's handbook for that, but for a normal strength individual, you're talking about somebody not carrying in excess of about 35 pounds. I think, obviously modified by weight allowance due to a higher strength, and certainly in no case carrying something heavy. So this doesn't apply if you've got some rug worth 500 gold rolled up and wrapped over your shoulder. Neither does it apply here, nor does it apply in surprise, which we've already covered. Simultaneous initiative. So the simultaneous initiative, it will often occur that initiative determination results in a tie. This merely indicates that each party has equal chances for acting and that attacks occur simultaneously. In cases of equal initiative score, damage accrues to both groups regardless of what is inflicted. When opponents in melee have tied for initiative, blows, attack routines included, occur simultaneously except when both opponents are using weapons. Each weapon has a speed factor, and in the case of otherwise simultaneous blows, the opponent with the weapon which has the lower speed factor will strike first. Thus, a blow from a fist, well, that's not really a weapon, so that's probably a poor example, but it's in there. Thus, a blow from a fist occurs. Let's just call it a dagger, okay? Well, we can't really call it a dagger because dagger is cited as well, but never mind. Thus, a blow from a fist occurs before a blow with a dagger, 1 to 2. A dagger before a short sword, 2 to 3. A short sword prior to a hammer, 3 to 4, and so on. And those numbers in parentheses, if it's not obvious, they're citing the speed factor of the weapons involved. So it gives a speed factor of a fist a speed factor. The text does, it gives it a speed factor of 1. Dagger has a speed factor of 2. So 1 is less than 2, so that the fist would attack first. A dagger has a speed factor of 2. Short sword has a speed factor of 3, so the dagger would attack first. Short sword has a lower speed factor than a hammer, so the short sword would attack first. Now, this is something else that I see most DMs not really bother with, and that's fine. That's again, that's the DM's prerogative, but we're talking about tournament rules and so on and so forth. So simultaneous initiative, the blows only occur at the same time if we're not in a situation where both opponents have weapons and those weapons have differing speed factors. Okay. And if those weapons have differing speed factors, one is perfectly capable of going before the other, and damage will be dealt from that weapon before the other person has been able to attack, even though initiative is simultaneous. This now we have to also consider if the number of attacks are unevenly matched, like we talked about a little further up. Say one particular character in a particular group, in Group A, going back to that, has multiple attack routines. Then where he strikes first and last in the round, that is still obeyed. Okay, so this doesn't supersede that. This doesn't take the place of that. That still has to be considered, and the ordering of the attacks are modified as a result. Okay, so weapon speed factor. We'll talk about this is in the DMG, and we need to discuss this. This number is indicative of the wieldiness of any particular weapon, how long it takes to ready the weapon against an opponent, or how long it takes to recover and move it in its attack mode. A pike, for example, is a 13. It has a weapon class of 13, or a weapon speed factor of 13, as it must be lowered, grasped, and then held/thrust firmly. Such a weapon is not usable in dungeon settings or anywhere else without masses of other pikes to support it. In the latter case, an opponent surviving the first attack from the bearer of the pike will likely be able to strike several times before recovery of the pike for a second thrust. This is further detailed below. A two-handed sword with a 10 speed factor likewise requires a lengthy readying time and recovery period after its attack due to its size and weight. Now, we need to pause here for a second and look at that. It makes perfect sense, right? But this paragraph sort of contradicts the paragraph that comes after it. This paragraph makes it sound like this is always the case. Okay, which would make sense, right? Say somebody with a pike with a weapon speed factor of 13 is solo without an army of pikes around him, and you've got a guy with a dagger with a speed factor of 2, right? The guy with the pike is going to stab, and God help him if he misses, because the guy with the dagger is going to be well within the reach of that pike, and then just cut this guy to pieces, right? But that's not, even though this paragraph indicates that that's what would happen, that's not. That doesn't occur all the time. It only occurs in very specific circumstances. And those circumstances are when weapon speed factor is the determinant of which opponent strikes first in a melee round. That's when it happens. There's a chance that one opponent will be entitled to multiple attacks. Okay. Now, I'll go ahead and continue reading this. Compare the score of the lower factored weapon with that of the higher. If the difference is at least twice the factor of the lower, or 5 or more factors in any case, the opponent with the lower factored weapon is entitled to 2 attacks before the opponent with the higher weapon factor is entitled to any attack whatsoever. If the difference is 10 or greater, the opponent with the lower factored weapon is entitled to 2 attacks before the opponent is allowed to attack, and 1 further attack at the same time the opponent with the higher speed factored weapon finally is allowed to attack. Note that such speed factor considerations are not applicable when either closing or charging a melee, but after an initial round of combat or in cases where closing charging was not necessary. The speed factor considerations are applicable. So it talks here, like I said, the prior paragraph is contradicted by this one. When weapon speed factor is the determinant of which opponent strikes first in a melee round. The two primary instances in which that takes place are when the initiative is simultaneous, or when you have somebody using a melee weapon against the spellcaster and trying to determine whether or not the spell goes off before the weapon is allowed to strike, thus interrupting the spell. So those are the two cases where you really need to pay attention to this, assuming that you're going to do the right thing and use weapon speed factors. Okay. So since this is a really dense paragraph, I'll give you a couple of examples, right? So we're looking at the difference. So if the difference, let's say there's simultaneous initiative. Let's say individual A and individual B have simultaneous initiative. Individual A is wielding a dagger. Individual B is wielding a longsword. The dagger has a speed factor of 2. The longsword has a speed factor of 5. Okay. So the dagger, okay, the longsword is at least twice the speed factor of the lower, which is the dagger. So 5 is greater than 2 times 2, right? So the dagger will get to attack 2 times before the longsword gets to attack at all. Okay. So the dagger will attack 2 times, and then the longsword gets to attack right afterward. And this is simultaneous initiative, so that means those 2 dagger attacks and any inflicted damage apply to the guy with the longsword before he ever gets to make an attack. So it is quite possible to die in simultaneous initiative if you use the rules as they're written, which is pretty sad. You know, so you roll simultaneous initiative, you're like, great, it happens at the same time, I've got a chance. And then you just end up dying anyway. Now, it gets even worse with something like a pike. We'll compare the dagger with the pike. Individual A is armed with a dagger with a speed factor of 2. Individual 2 is armed with a pike with a speed factor of 13. So that's 10 or greater. Okay, so this means that the individual with the dagger is going to be able to attack twice, okay, before the pike is allowed to attack. And then pike might be a bad example. It might not be perfectly related to this, because that doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense, because the dagger has to actually make it past the pike before it can affect any sort of attack. But at any rate, the guy with the dagger is allowed to attack twice, and then simultaneously he's allowed to attack at the same time that the guy with the pike finally manages to attack. So maybe it does make sense. There's a way to rationalize it, and that's for sure. But if we don't use speed factors, and if we don't use speed factors, we lose a lot here. I would argue that everything we've read so far, if we don't use the related rule, we're losing a lot. We're taking a lot from the game. But I'll get off that. I'll get off that hill now. Inflicting damage, except as noted under simultaneous initiative above. Damage, or the general results of some attack routine, such as a turning of undead or casting of a slow spell, is inflicted upon the reacting party prior to allowing these creatures their portion of an action in the melee round. Thus, some of the members of the party which does not have the initiative might be caught in a web spell, others might be turned by a cleric, and some damaged or killed/destroyed by other spells, missile discharge, and blows from hand-to-hand weapons or handheld weapons before they ever have a chance to themselves act. The reacting party's action could be an attempt to flee, cast spells, hurl missiles, or melee. It does not matter. If the reacting party does use attack routines, for example, the damage so inflicted will be assessed immediately. This could well mean that if they win the initiative roll next round, they can attack a second time, doing damage accordingly before the opponent party can act. So this is basically just a long way of saying that as soon as an attack is rolled, unless the initiative is truly simultaneous, as soon as an attack is rolled, if it hits, it does damage. As soon as a spell is cast, if it's cast without interruption, whatever effect associated with it takes effect at that specific moment upon which it has been completed. And at the end, it's simply pointing out that, depending on what you are, losing initiative in the first round isn't necessarily the worst outcome. It adds to the randomness of the game and how that randomness can possibly provide a benefit, even though at first it might not seem that useful. So, say for example, Group A and Group B, dice for initiative. Group A wins. Group B loses. Group A gets to resolve its attacks. It attacks, it damages Group B, whatever. Group B gets to counterattack. They do the same thing to Group A, but then the next round, initiative comes up and Group B wins it. Group B is allowed to attack twice, essentially, in a row before Group A is allowed to attack a second time, and that might be the difference in combat. So losing initiative is not always the worst thing. It can be, but it's not. It's not necessarily always. I want to talk about. So we've got weapon versus armor type here, and I just put in discuss, okay, because weapon versus armor type is not really. What is it? I think it's page 38 on the PHB. There's a chart, and that's about all that's discussed about it. And there's things that we can talk about with that chart, including the origins of it, what it might get right and wrong. But I've included that chart in the simulator, so there's really nothing to read about it. I would rather show. But there's one last thing that I want to discuss, and that's the concept of helmets. Now, I did put a note right here because I considered it important before I even began talking about it. The helmet rule is not considered in the simulator. Okay, and there's reasons that I did not consider it. I'll read the text from the DMG, and it might give you some ideas about why I didn't include it. So it is assumed that an appropriate type of head armoring will be added to the suit of armor in order to allow uniform protection of the wearer. Wearing of a great helm adds the appropriate weight and restricts vision to the front 60 degrees only, but it gives the head AC 1. If a helmet is not worn, one blow in 6 will strike at the AC 10 head unless the opponent is intelligent, in which case one blow in 2 will be aimed at the AC 10 head. Randomly determined on a D6, 1 through 3 equals a head blow. Now, I have a few issues with this. One is it doesn't make much sense. Okay, a random determination to determine, particularly for an intelligent creature, whether they're going to strike at another creature's unarmored head makes about as much sense, in my opinion, as randomly determining whether an intelligent dragon is going to breathe during a round. I believe that it's fully within the DM's wheelhouse to make that determination for intelligent creatures. If you're dealing with a non-intelligent creature or a particularly stupid one, they might do things randomly. But when you're talking about someone with at least average intelligence, not totally below average intelligence, they're capable of making these decisions. Particularly in this case, since there's no penalty associated with aiming at the head. In fact, the head is AC 10, so it's the easiest thing to hit. So random determination in that point doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And if you can just attack whatever you want on any specific creature, variable armor class, as defined in a bunch of creatures in the monster manual, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You're always just going to attack the thing with the least armor class or the worst armor class. You're always going to do that, particularly if there's no penalty associated with it. So in order for this rule to actually work, unless the random determination is sort of a de facto or sort of virtual called shot system, you're going to have to develop some sort of called shot system. Perhaps some sort of penalty or something like that should be associated with it. I think it's important, obviously, that all characters wear helmets because it leaves their head completely vulnerable if they don't. I just don't think that this rule is the correct way to handle it. And your opinion might differ, but I think this is an area that could have been fleshed out considerably better. Most of the other stuff that proceeded in this document, I take no issue with. at all. There is always room for improvement, but this one in particular, uh, just it really seems, mostly in retrospect or after the fact, hindsight, that kind of stuff. It seems like just a reason to get people apart with their hard earned gold, and also to restrict the vision of people who are like, I've got a great helm, I have AC1, and Gygax or whomever else, getting irritated that they always buy the great helm. And I think it's about time to move into the simulator. All right, so here's the moment we've been waiting for, or at least the moment I've been waiting for. I've worked on this a lot longer than I expected. I'm calling this the AD&D Raw Combat Simulator. Okay, before I go any further in it, once again, I mentioned it before, but in case you missed it, I wanted to give a big shout out to my buddy Cooley. He's the one who inspired this and got me to write it. Since I think his idea, which was a brilliant idea, was that it is or it can be better to show than to tell. And what ended up coming out of it was very interesting to me, and particularly interesting because I don't think anybody has done anything like this. I've never seen anything like this. I mean, I guess you could sit around and play with the old AD&D combat wheel or whatever all day and and come up with something similar, which it was a genius invention, by the way. It was genius, I thought. I still don't know how it was done, but Tracy Hickman is a genius anyway. So this combat simulator, a little word about it. What it's designed to do is to show us what all of the rules that we've spoken about, which is why we went through that document in the first portion of this episode. What all of these rules do and how they change or can potentially change the outcome of combats. When we just read this stuff, we might have the perception that something doesn't change combat much, and therefore isn't important. Or we might have the alternate perception that something changes combat too much and therefore don't use it. What we really needed was some hard numbers. So thank you, Cooley. I appreciate it more than you know. And thanks for always being there for me. Peace, brother. So a little word about this. Apologies for the the user interface. It's it kind of is what it is, but I did the best I could with what I had to work with. The primary idea for me behind this, or the primary requirement in my mind, was to not write any HTML, CSS, JavaScript, Razor, XAML, none of that stuff. I do too much of that stuff as it is, and I decided that I wanted to do it not using any of that, just straight up C#. I mean, this is nerd talk. It's really kind of outside the scope of this, but I wanted to give a little bit of a technical background for anybody who was interested in it. And be that as it may, I'm actually working on it in a different, more modern interface because I'm stupid. But I intend to take this and release it in some way to people, as well as the preceding document once it gets cleaned up a little bit. But I want to put this tool in everybody's hands, and that might go with the source code or whatever. But I want to make sure that people have the opportunity to use it, because you'll think of ideas that I haven't thought of. I've run it. So we've got 100,000 simulations down here in this text box that clicking simulate populates and runs through. Given that, I've probably, in testing and in playing around with it, I've probably run between 1 and 2 billion of these simulations, because there was actually quite a bit of testing and that stuff involved. So I wanted to make it look goldenrod and give it some AD&D fonts or whatever to at least make it look authentic. So if it's too garish and too bright, I apologize for that, but I think it looks way better and, sort of has that old 80s, 90s probably charm to it, I hope. That said, let's go ahead and look at how to actually use this thing, right? So we have a number of tabs up top. The combat tab is where we're going to run all of our simulations. All of this stuff lives inside that tab, and this is the stuff that we are most interested in. I'm going to skip over to the simulation result tab. The simulation result tab shows all of the simulations. Basically, I just write them out to a database and then I show them here. This data is not exceptionally useful in its current state, but I wanted to keep it for historical purposes so I could analyze it and decide how it might become more useful in an aggregated report or something like that. Now, the AD&D data table is what drives all this stuff. Similarly, it's kept in a database. So I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning. These are basically just sort of imports from the PHP. I have a number of these databases, but I made this one specifically for this application. So it's got the armors. So the data is not it's going to look kind of weird in some cases. We've got armors, attack matrices, character classes, dexterity adjustments, item saving throws, monster attack matrices, saving throws, shields, strength adjustments, weapon types. This just drives the drop down, missile weapons and melee weapons. Now, for the purposes of moving forward in this, the most important part of this is actually the weapons melee and the weapons missile. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about weapon type or weapon versus armor type. We've talked a little bit about that here, and you can actually see those results because I've brought it in. Same thing with weapons melee. Weapons melee has some additional stuff that we can talk about, but this is what I meant by talking further about weapon versus armor type. Weapon versus armor type is not commonly used. Like I said before, it exists on a single page in the PHP, and it's mentioned in brief passing on a couple of occasions in the context of, well, if you're using weapon versus armor type, then this happens. I think that's a shame. I don't think that really does the game justice for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons being, let's just say, if I'm gonna pick the low hanging fruit. If I'm a fighter, okay, why should I ever use anything except the weapon that does the most damage versus small and medium creatures, and the most damage versus large creatures, and also a blunt weapon so that I can be proficient at damaging skeletons. I think that dumbs down the game personally, and I think it's a great mistake. You basically ignore these at your peril. Okay. The same goes for speed factor. We already talked about how important speed factor is under certain circumstances. And then we have the weapon length, which is kind of a flavor thing. And sometimes it roughly corresponds to the space required. Now we can draw a little bit of data out of this and determine really whether the weapon's a slashing weapon or a piercing weapon, or both, based on the length and space required by comparing those fields. Right. So an example of that would be a battle axe. Its length is 4 feet. The space required is 4 feet. It's pretty clear that you have to slash with that weapon, even if you didn't know what a battle axe is. This is the reason I mention it, is to show that kind of all of this stuff works together. Even if it seems like a lot of numbers to look at on the surface, all of this stuff works together, and it was fairly well thought out. We look at the pikes, for example. basically just about any of the pole arms rather. But I had pike on the brain. It's 18 feet long, but it only requires space of 1 feet 1 foot in order to wield it effectively. Of course, like we talked about before, you're not going to want to do that on your own. You're probably not going to want to walk around. Imagine trying to turn a corner with that thing, right? So you're not going to want to go into the dungeon. It's also important to mention that space required sort of flows into the rule about 3 abreast in a 10-foot wide hall, 3 abreast in the dungeon, basically, because we all know that most dungeons are built with 10-foot wide halls for whatever reason. Space required should modify that, right? It would modify that if you use that. But a lot of people, unfortunately, just dump this entire table other than the weapon type, damage small, medium, and damage large. Some people don't even use the weapon weight and GP. And again, that's their choice. I'm not gonna fault anybody for that. Play the game the way that you want. For me, I personally feel like there's nothing in this table that can be taken away. Refined, sure, but there's nothing in this table that can be taken away without affecting something else in this table. Okay. And that's an important consideration because I feel that way about AD&D as a whole. You can't really take anything out unless you understand what sort of impact it's going to have on the game. If you I'm going to leave that alone at that point. We'll see. The simulation results, once we actually run some of those, will help us determine whether that's true or not. Is there anything else I need? Yes, something very important to mention about this is weapon versus armor type is truly weapon versus armor type. It is not weapon versus armor class. Okay, so let's say individual A versus individual B. We'll call them combatants. Combatant A and combatant B. Say both of these guys are wearing chainmail and a shield, which gives them an armor class of 4. Okay. Now let's further say that combatant A has a dexterity defensive adjustment that brings his armor class down to 2. Okay. When they attack each other, all right, they both attack with whatever modifier is present under the AC 4 column because it's their armor type. It doesn't factor in dexterity adjustments. It doesn't factor in any of that stuff. It doesn't factor in magical armor. Nothing. It's just the armor type. And since it's the armor type, it's probably a good idea to mention that it doesn't really apply to monsters. It doesn't really apply to monsters that are non-humanoid or that can't be approximated by the DM immediately to be wearing some sort of armor. Say you take a goblin or a hobgoblin. Yeah, a hoblin. I just made up a new monster for the Fiendfolia. You take a goblin or a hobgoblin or or an orc or an ogre. It's their armor class roughly corresponds to the type of armor that they might be wearing. And so generally with humanoids, I would use the weapon versus armor type modifiers. For other creatures, that's purely DM discretion. Under very specific cases, I might assign an armor type to a monster. An example might be Boule. Not the crest on their back or whatever. That's a AC 6 or whatever it is. But the rest of it, I might approximate that to AC 2. Plate, mail, and shield, and modify the dice rolls of its combatants by the value shown. Now, monsters, okay, who are using weapons, also use these modifiers for their weapon attacks. So, in a lot of cases, this is actually a good thing for the player characters. In many cases, particularly the more armored ones, but in many cases, this is a very good thing to introduce this to the game for your players, because all told, bringing all of this stuff in increases the dangerousness of your opponents, increases the increases a little bit of a simulationist feel, although I would consider that certainly secondary. But it also sort of evens out between monsters and players and adds a dynamic mechanic to the game that you don't get in any other games. And I don't think that's I don't think it's a particularly good idea to throw that out, at least without looking at it and really analyzing it and determining whether or not it's right for you. I know that I know that Gary railed against some of this stuff, and I understand that, and I have my opinions, but now's not really the time or the place for that. Just suffice it to say, for the purposes of this, as I've already rambled too long, for the purposes of what we're trying to do here, this is definitely in use. I definitely use this in my own games when I'm not running my own games with an even more simulationist approach, which I do. Okay, but if I'm just trying to play AD&D straight, these modifiers are absolutely essential, as essential as considering speed factor, as essential as considering space required, as essential as damage small, medium, large, right? Absolutely critical. Now, missile weapons. Okay, missile weapons are a little bit of a different type of creature. Number one, the first thing we need to talk about is that they don't have a speed factor associated with them, right? And so if we look back or think back to what we talked about, the rules are very clear that speed factor only really matters. Weapon speed factor only really matters when two opponents are fighting each other and they're both armed with weapons, melee weapons specifically, or when a combatant has a melee weapon and is trying to interrupt a spell before that spell has completed casting. Okay, so that's one of the reasons that speed factors aren't included on missile weapons, and it's also one of the reasons that missile weapons don't it might be, let me rephrase that, it might be one of the reasons missile weapons not having a speed factor could have been the cause for the speed factor rules being written the way that they were in the simultaneous initiative and all of that stuff, because we have to remember that the game was built upon layer, and if certain layers had flaws or even merits or ideas, AD&D basically grew out from that evolution, often without a lot of thought. It was a quick affair, and it necessarily needed to be for a number of reasons. But anyways, missile weapons do not have a speed factor associated with them. Now they do have, which we talked about, 3 times rate of fire, 3 times normal rate of fire for round in a surprise situation, 3 times per segment. Okay, so that's where we would get our fire rate. We would look at our fire rate and we would see that it's for hand axe it's 1, for a bow generally speaking it's 2. Well, for all bows, crossbows are 0.5 for the heavy crossbow. That means it takes 2 rounds to load that thing. So again, talking about DM discretion in terms of the keyword ready as it relates to times 3 fire during each segment is very important. And AD&D gives us as DMs plenty of opportunities to adjudicate things. This is but one of them, and I would recommend that the biggest thing that I would recommend is that whatever you adjudicate, you do it consistently. Okay, because players are smarter than DMs think they are, and certain players pay very very particular attention to some of these things and notice when rules change between sessions. Light crossbow has a fire rate of 1. 2 daggers, you can throw 2 daggers. So in the times 3 example, like we kind of talked about with daggers, they're ready, right? So that's the only way, 3 times the normal rate of fire. is possible. Now, if you can tell me that that an individual gets 2 segments of surprise, and in those 2 segments he can each throw 6 daggers, that's just, it's simply not, that doesn't go. So I understand people railing against that particular rule, but I think it's misplaced. One note worth mentioning is that if you look at page 38 of the PHP, you'll see a little footnote underneath the chart, and it'll say something to the effect of these armor class adjustments are for short range, and that medium and long range apply a -2 and a -5 on top of whatever these modifiers are. That's not said anywhere else, and I think it really just got subsumed into the penalty to hit for short range or for medium range and long range, rather, because to hit, medium range is -2, long range is -5. Now this simulation doesn't take any of that into account, so these aren't really important in the context of this, but it's just something to keep an eye out for if you're actually reading the original PHP information. Surely you don't get a -2 to hit and then an additional -2 to hit on top of whatever armor type modifier is presented in the table. All right. Well, I think at this point, let me think real quickly, make sure I haven't forgotten anything. Yeah, I think we're ready to look at a couple of simulations and talk about how this works. Okay, so we've got 3 result panes over here. We've got surprise, we've got initiative, and we've got combat. I've basically split it out into 3 separate phases so we can look at it statistically. We've got a combatant 1, and we have a combatant 2. I put a little convenience check mark in here for using maximum hit points, right? So that if I adjust the creature's level, I can either choose the hit points, or I don't have to choose the hit points, or the creature's character class, rather, the combatant's character class. I can either choose the hit points or not. So, for example, if I uncheck this, that's going to change the normal human to a hit point total of 3. Okay, but it's really useful if I want to level a guy up. I can't level up a non-human because a normal human, because they're level 0, right? They don't have any levels. But clerics and stuff like that, I can. I also built into here the level limits if for things like druids and monks. I didn't really do anything with the bard. He's just in this list because, and I have no interest in bards anyways. Although the AD&D bard is the most interesting of the bards that I don't have any interest in. And we've got strength and dexterity adjustments. I didn't include exceptional strength. I didn't feel like it was really important. This disappearing microphone is starting to irritate me. But these do take effect in the circumstances under which they're supposed to be applied. We've got a list of armor type, list of shield type. Okay, note here that medium shield is sort of something that AD&D players kind of managed to invent themselves. I think the Dungeon Master's Guide does say something about the medium shield, but a medium shield, for all intents and purposes, is considered the same as a small shield, and that's why you won't find it, to the best of my recollection, on the equipment chart. Okay, it's just a different type of shield with the same characteristics and attributes. Armor class is a automatically calculated value, and then we've got a list of the various types of weapons and a weapon type, whether that be melee or missile, and then whatever's necessary to hit AC 0 for convenience sake is auto-populated here. However, the simulation does take into effect the repeating 20s, so that's all built in there, and that all works the way that it's supposed to. The repeating 20s is a concept to AD&D that sort of goes outside of the basic to hit armor class 0 designation. And for anybody who hasn't checked that out and who wants to know more about it, go check out my Thaco video. It's rambling nonsense, but it gets to the point. Okay, it's long, but it gets to the point. And then down here, we have all of the things that we talked about, right? We have, or at least the vast majority of the things that we talked about. We have the surprise segments. We have the times three missile rate during surprise. We have simultaneous initiative. We have weapon speed factors, and we have weapon versus armor type. I'm not really sure. I've run so many of these, and I've had so many ideas with how I might end up presenting this thing and what would be most valuable, that I'm really not quite sure anymore. So I'm going to reset this to a normal human. Okay. And I'm going to turn all of these off. All right. So the primary purpose for turning these all off is to establish a baseline before we've applied these options. And the other purpose being that there are plenty of game systems that don't use any of this, or plenty of DMs, regardless of game system, who don't use any of this and just prefer, very simple, straightforward combat with no, in their mind, I suppose, unnecessary complications. I tend to like to complicate the hell out of it, but excuse me, maybe that's just me. So we have an effective baseline now, and we can see what these two guys, normal humans with battle axes, maximum hit points, is just 0 level fighters, basically. See what happens with them. Would expect the results to be even across the board for the most part, with some small variance. We can see surprise summary. Okay, the impact on each individual, an initiative summary, the impact on each individual under a tied initiative circumstance, which of course we're not going to have because we're not using simultaneous initiative. If initiative results are tied in this case, then initiative is simply reruled. In combat, we've got the combat summary and then a combat breakdown, including the number of rounds that were used in 100,000 simulations, or however many simulations you intend to run, and then how it breaks down for each individual in the combat. And indeed, these are all basically what we would expect to see. They're all fairly even, or really, really close, given how many iterations we've gone through to determine results. Excuse me. So this is about what we would expect. So let's go with let's do this. Let's see how a ability score change affects these numbers. Okay, because you will have ability score adjustments even if you are running a very, very simple combat, and this should give us a pretty good idea of how much is a relatively large change in outcome from an ability score increase, which should let us know how much is a relatively large change from an option change perspective. I'll also mention that down here we've got the runtime. I felt like the runtime was important to include so that we could get an idea of how long it takes for a computer to run all of these simulations, and then what percentage beyond that it takes as we enable some of the rules as written. Okay, because that can give us a basic approximation of how much overhead is required in order to do this. Granted, this is a computer and it's not a human being, but having a percentage that we can work with, we can basically use that to say, hey, if you enable all these options and you know exactly what you're doing and you've got it all down, smooth and by the numbers, and the combat flows the way it's supposed to, you can expect all of these options to add X percentage of time to your combats. In some cases, it might even end up reducing it. Anyway, so let's go ahead and adjust this guy's dexterity up by 1. Okay, which is going to give him a -1 defensive adjustment and making his AC 9. Okay. and we'll simulate that. With an AC of 9, he now wins, instead of 50% of the time, he now wins 53% of the time. This dexterity is not high enough to give him anything else. Okay, it doesn't give him a reaction and attacking adjustment. But so it doesn't impact surprise. Of course, it doesn't impact initiative because he's not using a missile weapon. So even if he had a reaction attacking adjustment, it wouldn't. Now, the simulation, if I didn't mention it previously, assumes that these guys are unencumbered. Even if armor changes and whatever, for the purposes of demonstration, dexterity, reaction, and attacking adjustment will apply to missile fire or handheld weapon use in initiative scenarios. Okay, so that point of dexterity brought him up to 53%. Now let's say we take that back down and we give him instead a 16 strength, which is going to give him a +1 damage. Let's see if we get about the same 3% additional or 7% swing. It's actually more, more like a 13% swing and a 6.5% increase to his ability to kill the other person. So dexterity, at least at the lower levels of dexterity, isn't as important. All it does is reduce armor class. So a point lower of armor class is not as effective necessarily as adding a point of damage. So let's go ahead and take this back, right? And we'll bring up combatant one's dexterity to a point where he has a -2 defensive adjustment and a +1 reaction attacking adjustment. And since this assumes that he's unencumbered, this means we're not using surprise segments. Okay, so the maximum amount of surprise in any given surprise round is or any given surprise result determination is one loss segment, basically one opportunity for the guy who's not surprised to attack the other combatant, right? So at this point, we do that, and there are no loss segments. Okay, so essentially there's no surprise. Now, it's important to note that dexterity adjustments for reaction and attacking adjustment above a dexterity of 16 do exist. For 17 and 18. And effectively what this does is if you don't use surprise segments, we can see right here that with a dexterity of 16, an individual will never be surprised. So a dexterity of 17 and 18 have no impact on surprise beyond what a 16 has. And that's an example of not using something within the rules and then seeing that it is affected a core mechanic such as an ability score adjustment down the line. But it might not occur to you unless you really analyze it or look at it through a program such as this. Okay. And in this case, of course, it brought his AC down to 8 because his defensive adjustment is -2. So it makes him more effective than this guy. But he wins 61% of the time. If we even this guy out, let's just say we give him some leather armor to make him armor class 8, and run the simulation, we'll still be able to see what the impact of no surprise for this individual, potential surprise of 1 round for this individual, and okay. So this guy, just by virtue of not being able to be surprised, these two guys are completely equal. Battle axes, no armor. This guy has leather armor. This combatant 1, is going to win 54% of the time. So this dexterity increase more than makes up for the leather armor, even though the defensive adjustment only takes it to an AC 8, which is equivalent to leather armor. Because it's made it to where this guy is effectively unsurprisable. Okay. Now, it's also eliminated equal surprise. Okay. Now, if we go ahead and turn on surprise segments, that should change things a bit. Okay. Let's turn on surprise segments. Let's take this back down to a 14. Okay. Let's turn off this armor and simulate so that we get back to even results. One thing that sticks out immediately, and I think I mentioned this, is that by turning on surprise segments, we reduce the frequency that both people are surprised equally and just standing there. Okay. And I think that's a desirable outcome. Having it happen 5%, like 1 out of every 20 times, is a lot more desirable than having it happen 1 out of every 10 times, in my opinion, because people just standing there not doing anything is not the essence of the game, at least as far as I'm concerned. Now we can see here that we still don't have, any of this stuff because we haven't enabled simultaneous initiative. So now let's go ahead and crank this guy's dex up by 1. These guys are even still. Crank this guy's dex up by 1. He's got an AC of 9 now. We're just going to go ahead and give this guy a shield, which will give him an AC of 9, and see how the results play out. Okay, so we're basically even. Okay, because they have equivalent armor class. If we take the shield away, we'll say that there's the 3% additional chance for combatant 1 to win this this duel, right? Now, if we if we raise his dexterity by a point, this is going to give him a +1 reaction and attacking adjustment, which will lessen the amount of surprise necessary to him, or that applies to him. Remember before, when we raised his dexterity to 16, he was incapable of being surprised. But now we've got a normal surprise probability of 1 and 2 on a 1d6, so 33 2/3%. Is that what that is? I think so. So we've got a we've got a 2 and 6 probability, but this guy is no longer surprise immune, which works in combatant 2's favor, and also allows for dexterities higher than 16 to have a meaningful effect, particularly as you get into situations where probabilities for surprise is higher than the 1 and 2 chance. So let's simulate this and see how it works out. Okay, so we can see now that this guy, his surprise, combatant 1 surprise, is not 0 anymore because 2 segments are possible, and he only gets -1 segment on that. Both surprised equally, okay, has gone down even more. Okay, so a dexterity change makes that go down even more when surprise segments are used. So now we're down to 1 in 40, basically, somewhere around there. So we've even further eliminated the everybody just standing there effect. Now we can see the result of this if we look a little bit deeper. This dexterity with surprise segments is disadvantageous to this guy because now he can be surprised. However, this guy still has a lot of problems. The main metric here is that combatant number 1 has only taken 6,219 hits. Combatant number 2, on the other hand, has taken 21,275 for a total damage of 95,670, which contributes heavily to his lower or his higher frequency of death. And if we look at the total damage that's dealt and the number of times died before attacking, and or the total damage dealt between both of them, we could see that combatant 2, by virtue of dying more often or missing, but in this case specifically dying before being able to attack, we can see that that's one of the reasons that he's having such a rough go at it. Now, we're going to keep these things equally. We're going to reset to baseline, right? And we're going to look at simultaneous initiative. Simultaneous initiative, I like to think of as a it doesn't affect the mechanics much, particularly if you're not using weapon speed factors and you're not and and you're not dealing with two combatants who both have melee weapons, or a spellcaster and a combatant with a melee weapon. But the simultaneous initiative, even in that case, is kind of a flavor thing, and it makes things a little bit more interesting beyond re-rolling initiative a whole bunch of times and increasing the amount of times that you have to roll dice. Because as we can see here, the runtime has gone down to less than 0.1 second, because there's less overall rolling, because with surprise segments there's less overall rolling, and then with simultaneous initiative this might even go lower. Honestly, I'm not sure. I forget. But let's go ahead and simulate this out and see what happens. Okay, so the runtime goes up a little bit, and that's fine. That's processing and whatever, but it's still lower than the initial without any options applied. So in this case, this is the flavor that I'm talking about, and you miss out on this entirely. Okay, instead you just re-roll dice. If you don't use simultaneous initiative, you entirely miss out on what happens here, and that's that 16.67% of combat rounds are going to result in ties, which are going to allow you to use things like weapon speed factors as determinants, which are also going to allow you to have deaths during simultaneous initiative. So, hey, I got a 3. Oh, he got a 3 too. Hey, but there's a chance. But you might still die, or the other guy might still die. And that, to me, adds to excitement for the DM and excitement for the players, because there's a very little that's more exciting than having a tied initiative roll and slaying your enemy while you still stand, while you make it through it, or vice versa, right? So the tied initiative fallout on something like this, these should be even about 5,800 deaths, about 5% for each of these guys. But then you have something else that's actually really exciting, and happens in fantasy literature, happens in movies, and happens in your mind's eye when you're thinking about this stuff. And that's the concept of mutual deaths. Okay, unless you're using simultaneous initiative, you will not have mutual deaths. And mutual deaths are basically just what they sound like. It's, I rolled a 3, he rolled a 3, we attack each other, we both die. Fatal blows for both combatants, and that's exceptionally dramatic, and that can change the game in meaningful in meaningful ways. All right, so what would be the next thing that we want to look at here? I would say that since we brought simultaneous initiative into it, we should probably go ahead and look at weapon speed factors, because the weapon speed factors are going to figure into simultaneous initiative like we talked about before. If a weapon speed factor is lower than the opposing weapon speed factor by, so I'll just give an example. A weapon speed factor of 2 versus a weapon speed factor of 4. If the slower weapon is twice as slow, or the faster weapon is twice as fast as the slower weapon, then that affords the attacker 2 attacks during simultaneous initiative. Okay, that's also, it doesn't have to be twice as much, as you'll recall, if it's 5 or more in any case. So if you've got a dagger with a speed factor of 2, and you have a footman's flail with a speed factor of 7, the 7 is 5 or more. That's not really the best example. Let me think of a different one. Longsword, right? Longsword is 5, and two-handed sword is 10. So that's 5 or more. I mean, it's also double 2. So I guess I don't have a very good example for you there. But if it's times 2 between faster weapon and slower weapon, or there's a difference of 5 in any case, that affords the guy with the quicker weapon 2 attacks, And if it's 10 or more, say, I think we talked about an example of a dagger and a pike, dagger being 2, pike being 13, that's 10 or more difference. There's 2 attacks for the dagger, then the pike and the dagger attack simultaneously. So I think moving into weapon speed factor is the next best choice. Okay, we shouldn't expect to see any differences here because we're still using battle axes. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. Okay, nothing really different, as expected. Everything plays out the way that we expected it to. Now, what happens if we take a weapon that's faster, is faster enough to afford the first combatant 2 attacks in the round versus the battle axe? An easy way to do that, I mean, I can do some of it from memory, but let's look at the speed factor on the battle axe, right? That's 7, okay, and it does 1d8 damage. What I'd like to do is find something that's a speed factor of 3. Bow stick. Yeah. Let's go ahead and use a short sword. It does 1d6, so it does less damage. And we saw previously that increasing the strength so that there's a damage adjustment, that increasing strength makes a big difference, even bigger than decreasing armor class by a single point. Increasing damage by a single point makes a big difference. So this guy with the battle axe is still going to have a significant advantage based on damage. I don't know exactly how that's going to work out, but it's 1d8 versus 1d6 damage. But now we're using weapon speed factors, and this battle axe is twice as slow as the sword, or more properly stated, the sword is twice as fast as the battle axe. Tied initiative is only 16.69% of the combat rounds. So this is only going to occur during 16.69% of combat rounds. But we'll see how that, we'll see whether or not that's capable of making up for its inferior damage. Okay, it doesn't fully make up for its inferior damage, but it makes a significant difference and gives the guy with the short sword a chance, right? Because I think it was somewhere around 10% of a difference if strength increased by 1 point, if damage increased by 1 point. In this case, we have a maximum damage that's 2 points better, and we combatant 2 only wins 2% more of the time than combatant 1. Without weapon speed factors, we can simulate that, and we can see that it's 57 versus 40. Okay, so this actually gives weapon speed factors help out the guy with the short sword and show that if you use these rules, weapon choice matters. Okay, just in terms of weapon speed factors, weapon choice matters. That's not even going into weapon versus armor type. So let's go ahead and do that next. Let's look at weapon versus armor type and determine how that changes things, because there are modifiers for weapon versus armor type. Armor class 10 is an armor type. So if we look here, we can see in melee weapons, AC 10 would be the armor type that we're using for the modifier. So let's get an idea of what that looks like. AC 10 is going to be a modifier of +2 for a battle axe, and then we've got another guy with a short sword, and it's going to be +2. So enabling weapon versus armor type for a battle axe and a short sword, we should get the same results that we've gotten previously. Now, what we can do next, let's go ahead and get ready to change these around a little bit. Okay, because normal human is not a very good example once we start getting a little more complex, because they have so few hit points, right? And we want more hit points to sort of open up the options to work the way that they're supposed to. Yeah, we don't want the possibility. So battle axe versus a short sword, for example, with each guy having 6 hit points, the battle axe is far more likely to kill the 6 hit point dude in one shot than the short sword is to kill the 6 hit point dude in one shot, right? Because the battle axe does 1 through 8 damage. So it's going to kill on a 6, 7, or 8, which is, a number of factors more likely than the short sword only being able to do that on a 1 and 6. So let's go ahead and simulate that with fighters and see what we come up with. Okay, so with weapon versus armor type, this battle axe has two additional possible points of damage, but this second combatant only wins out of 100,000 simulations, only wins 8,000 more times, or just shy of 8,000 more times. And that's because weapon speed factors, right? These weapons are equivalent in weapon versus armor type, but weapon speed factor gives this guy an additional attack a number of times. And you can see that the Fighter 2's deaths during surprise, or during tied initiative, rather, are very high. They're more than 3 times as often as combatant 1's deaths. And that's because the short sword is attacking twice. So let's go ahead and turn that off and see how these values change. So if we turn that off, this guy, just because of the battle axe, right, with its larger damage range and higher average damage, now he wins 60% of the time. So without weapon speed factors, there's no reason to do anything except choose a battle axe if you have the opportunity to do that, right? Because it's going to skew the combat versus somebody who's using a short sword. It's going to skew the combat in a big way. Weapon speed factors, particularly, they provide meaningful choice. And I apologize if I'm beating on a dead horse there, but I think meaningful choice in weapons is one of the most important things that you can do in the system. It's one of the important things you can provide for the players. Otherwise, if there's no meaningful weapon choice, weapon proficiencies, the number of weapon proficiencies each character gets, the fighter having additional weapon proficiencies, none of that stuff really matters. I mean, there's plenty of games that I've played a human fighter in, a human paladin, human ranger, whatever, right? And I'll be decked out. I'll have multiple weapons, like some kind of Mad Max and Beyond Thunderdome, right? But I don't use them. I just use my longsword. I just use whatever's best, whatever does the most damage. If I'm in a life or death situation, I'm not going to flavor text and decide to stab with a dagger just because I think it's cool, right? I'm going to use the most effective weapon as a player. Now, if I have meaningful choice, then that makes those weapon proficiency choices important. It makes the weapons that I carry important beyond just a previously mentioned example of, oh, it's a skeleton, I better use a blunt weapon. And then switch back to the longsword instantaneously. It makes a big difference. Okay. And it also makes a big difference if, say, you lose your most advantageous weapon and you need to switch to something else without being completely handicapped by that forced decision. So that's about all I'll say about that. So let's just go ahead and so we've got the battle axe has a speed factor of 7, right? Let's look at something where the speed factor is 10 or more. Let's take a look at the dagger, and we'll take a look at the pike. Okay, so we've got a first level fighter with a dagger. All right, this dagger should be able to attack 3 times, twice before the pike, and in tied initiative, twice before the pike, and 1 at the same time. This pike gets to attack once. Okay, let's see how it plays out here. And for by way of comparison, which will become important, the all pike does 1d6 damage, which is equivalent to short sword. So much like the battle axe being, having a range 2 higher than the short sword in those results we saw, the all pike has a range 2 points higher than the dagger. Let's see how this works out. Okay, so the guy with the dagger wins 70% of the combats versus the all pike, even though the all pike is capable of doing 2 additional points of damage. The dagger normally is not at all capable of doing 10 points of damage without this option in tied initiative, because what happens here is 41,000 times using weapon speed factors, 41,000 times this the fighter number 2, combatant number 2, dies during tied initiative. That's a huge difference, and it more properly represents what might actually happen in that kind of combat. I don't think anybody's going to tell you that any of this stuff is absolutely perfect, but it makes a huge difference. I'm not comfortable myself personally, and I don't know. There's 2 ways to look at it. You can say, well, everything's fine the way it is, and that by using these rules, you're introducing things that I don't want my game to change that much. But for me, when I look at something like the difference between, let's turn off weapon speed factors and run the same simulation, the guy with the dagger wins 56% of the time versus the all pike, without weapon speed factors being considered, and fighter 2 wins 41% of the time. I'm not comfortable with a huge swing like this not being included in the game, particularly when I think that makes a lot of that makes a lot of sense, adds a lot of flavor, provides meaningful choice for weapon type. There's just too much for me to throw out here. That's why I keep it all. And that's why I think that the game system was brilliantly designed. I don't care if that was through intuition. It certainly wasn't through editing, right? I think we can all agree on that. Whether that was through intuition or experience or blind luck or just building on a foundation that eventually kind of fell in place in a way that made a lot of this stuff look fairly genius, or if it was actual genius. I don't care. I like it. So let's go ahead and look more meaningfully at what weapon versus armor type might do. Because we talked about it and we used it, right? We enabled it, but we haven't actually changed the armor types. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's change the armor types. Let's give this guy leather armor. Let's give this guy leather armor. All right, let's give them, I want to isolate this for the moment. Let's give both of these guys short swords. We're going to leave simultaneous initiative. And it's fair enough to isolate this because they have the same speed factors. We don't have to necessarily turn off weapon speed factors in order to get results that we expect. Both these guys are level 1, standard ability scores at the higher range, but not enough to give them modifiers. Let's see what happens with both of these guys having leather armor. Now, since they both have short swords, everything's going to even out as we expect it to, right? Now, what happens if we find a weapon that also does 1d6? What? Club does that, right? Bow stick. The only time a bow stick has ever been used is in this simulation, right? And let me just double check to make sure I'm not giving you false information. Bow stick, yes, bow stick is 1d6, right? Let's see what happens here. Okay, the same thing. So this would lead me to expect that the bow stick is +1 or has the same modifier. I happen to see that it was +1 in that other chart. Has the same modifier versus AC type 8 as a short sword does. And see what we've got there. And indeed, that's the case. They both have a 1. So let's look at, let's find something else that does 1d6. All right, bow stick versus club, right? So bow stick is superior to club, in case anyone's wondering. So fighter 2 happens to have a club. Fighter 1 happens to have a bow stick. Let's see how it changes. Right. So fighter 1 wins a full almost 5% of the time more, simply for weapon versus armor type, even though all other things are the same. Now, without weapon versus armor type, there's absolutely no reason. I mean, I guess maybe speed factor would be an example. Space required 3 and speed factor 3. Club is 1 through 3 and speed factor's 4. So space required for the club is a little less because I guess you can jab a guy with the club and you can't do that with the bow stick. I don't know. But there's no reason to have a bow stick and a club, right? Just pick one or the other, average it out, because there's no meaningful difference in combat if weapon versus armor type is not used, right? Even if you're using weapon speed factors, the difference is not enough to make to have any impact on actual combat mechanics. So let's go ahead and simulate this and see what we're looking at. Once again, it evens it back out. Now, since I mentioned that there's no reason to have a bow stick and a club, it can be argued that without weapon versus armor type, speed factors aren't going to make a lot of difference with pole arms, which is what I'm going to talk about next. But without weapon versus armor type, the choice of pole arm, all of this stuff is just flavor, right? Which is why I've talked about a couple of times. Are you using AD&D as a source book, which is fine, as flavor, or are you partially? I guess I'm not going to say that anyone uses AD&D only as flavor, even though there probably are people who do that. Are you going to use that as a flavor text, or are you going to use it for the complex, rich, simulationist rule set that it manages to represent? And I choose that. So without weapon versus armor type, polearm choice, it just comes down to a matter of, hey, can I use it with the space required? Assuming that the DM even cares about space required, because a lot of people don't even bother with that, particularly when they're dealing in theater of the mind, or less formal type of game, and they just want to move things along. And it's going to depend, it's going to be affected by weapon. But I think that we'll see that a lot of the pole arms have the same space required and the same damage. So, they might have different speed factors. Let me see if I can find something that's not 5 or more. Military for, I want something that's basically a pole arm that's not 5 or more. Well, I suppose I can turn off weapon speed factors for it in order to demonstrate. So what we'll do is we'll use an all pike and a glaive, because they're both capable of doing 1d6 points of damage. They're both space required 1 foot. The all pike has a speed factor of 13 and the glaive has a speed factor of 8, which would give the glaive 2 extra attacks. And we can probably take a look at that in a second. But let's go ahead and give this guy a glaive. These are weapons that most people will never even use because it's just all the same, right? It's just flavor. Oh, am I going to use a rancier? Am I going to use a halberd? Am I going to use a glaive? Am I going to use a glaive gisarm? Am I going to use a volge? It doesn't really make a difference, So it's kind of pointless for Gary to have added them outside of text or flavor, unless you're using some of the rules that I know at times, he disavowed. So we're going to give, let me step back. We're going to give that guy a glaive, and we're going to give this guy an all pike, and we're just going to have a couple of idiots, the last 2 infantrymen standing on the field of battle after all the rest of the armies have been routed, and these guys are too stupid to go ahead and run or at least be friends or whatever. So let's look at his all pike, and they both do 1d6. We're going to turn off weapon speed factors and see what happens. It's dead even. So why would I choose a glaive? Why would I choose an all pike? Why would I have both of them? It's only flavor. There's no point in having both of these weapons. Now, if I turn on weapon speed factors, okay, this is going to give the glaive, since it's 5 factors lower, this is going to give the glaive 2 attacks to the all pikes 1. So I would expect a lot of this information to change, right? And we can see that it does. Combatant 1, who gets the 2 attacks on tied initiative, he kills his opponent 21,000 times during tied initiative, but he also wins in combat overall 56.78% of the time, 57% of the time, give or take. Right now, if we use weapon versus armor type, I don't recall what the modifier is for these on leather armor, but we will see these numbers change if the weapon versus armor class adjustment, or weapon versus armor type adjustment is different between the two, which would, so we've already seen that weapon speed factor makes these two different if you use it. Weapon versus armor type, if the modifier is different, makes these two weapons even further different, and it differentiates them. You can have your flavor, you can have your mechanics, you can have your meaningful weapon choice, and all of those things. You can have it all, all or nothing really. So let's simulate that and see what happens. Okay, it comes out to be about the same in terms of combat, in terms of ultimate result on who wins and who loses. Let's see what. So the all pike is 0 versus 8. Actually, what are we using? Yeah, we're using leather armor. The all pike is 0 and the glaive is 0. Let's go ahead and give these guys. Let's go ahead and give these guys no armor. Okay, and turn off this speed factor, because no armor is actually different. So AC type 10, they're different. So let's go ahead and simulate that. And we can see that the glaive is far more effective than the all pike against an unarmored opponent, giving it meaningful impact in combat, and a meaningful reason for it to exist, and a meaningful reason for a player to choose it for their character. If we add weapon speed factors, it skews it even further, as now the glaive gets 2 attacks. Let's see. Okay. Let's go ahead and take it a different direction. We're going to use a short sword, and we are going to use a missile weapon. All right, so that we can apply this ×3 missile fire rate during surprise and see what kind of difference that it actually makes. Now, I only did that on the bows. Okay. I didn't do it on the rest of these weapons. Remember the caveat that, or disclaimer or whatever, that ready weapons being ready is a prerequisite of the 3 times fire rate, and that ready is a DM determination, however he wants to handle it. So we won't see that on the hand axe, but we don't even need simultaneous initiative for this. We don't need weapon speed factors for this, because weapon speed factors aren't even going to apply. In fact, we can keep that checked, I believe, if I've programmed this correctly, which I hope I have after significant amount of time in testing. And we've got weapon versus armor type. I'm going to take out weapon versus armor type for now. So we've got surprise segments, we've got 3-time missile fire rate during surprise, and we have weapon speed factors. Hand axe versus a short sword, right? I believe hand axe does the same amount of damage as a short sword. ×3 missile fire rate during supplies is not going to apply because it's not a bow in this case. And we find that once again, we get things evened out. So even if we turn this off for this particular result, it's not going to make a difference. Now, if we turn this back on and we choose one of the bows, let's say a longbow, right? 1d6, 1d6, same deal, and simulate that. We see that the ×3 missile fire rate during surprise only changed the results by 7%. So, and that's assuming that this guy has unlimited ammunition and that everything is ready. So in the most absurd samples that people tend to cite, given 2 first level fighters with maximum hit points, and one of them being a archer and one of them being a hand-to-hand guy with a short sword, it only affects things 7% of the time. And I think that it's important to realize that it's not as extreme as people say it is. I cannot think of a good reason not to use this rule. I simply can't. You can modify it however you want, but I don't really think it needs modification, because I don't think what the DMG is saying is that, hey, always, no matter what, 6 arrows per segment. And that's all there is to it. I don't think that that's what's going on. maybe some people play that way. And if they do, it's only going to change the combat in at least this specific scenario. It's only going to give a 7% advantage to the combatant with the missile weapon. On maximum standardized 2-segment surprise. So let's go ahead and turn everything on. And I think the last part of this we'll look at is melee, hand-to-hand combat between. Let's do it between a couple of different classes here, right? Let's take a cleric and let's take a fighter, and let's give them. We're going to change this guy back to. We're going to give him a missile weapon or a melee weapon. Sorry. We're going to give him a club, which does 1d6, and we're going to give this fighter, okay, a short sword. I'm actually going to turn off. No, I don't suppose I need to really turn off anything because there's no armor. There's no armor yet or anything like that. So let's just go ahead and run this the way it is. Okay, this fighter, combatant 2, neither guy is armored, right? Combatant 2 with the short sword, even though it's equal damage, he only has 2 extra hit points. Their AC 0 values necessary to hit are the same, so there's not much of a meaningful difference at level 1 between a fighter and a cleric. Not much of a meaningful difference. The difference between a fighter and a cleric is that the cleric gets to cast spells and the fighter might have 2 more hit points, right? In instances where you roll for hit points at first level, I mean, this is a significant nerf on the fighter. Not using this stuff is a significant, or can be a significant nerf on the fighters, right? So the fighter rightly wins 64% of the time in the case of short sword versus club for the cleric. But if we turn off weapon versus armor type, that might change. It does. The fighter loses 5% chance to kill this cleric by not using weapon versus armor type. And that's unfair, right? I think, the fighter should be more capable. An unarmored fighter should be significantly more capable than at killing an unarmed cleric than unarmed cleric should be at being able to kill an unarmed fighter. The fighter is the weapon specialist. He always has been. And you don't need to add weapon specialization and double weapon specialization and all of this foolishness. You just need to use the rules that were originally in the system, provided you understand them and provided you have an easy and simplified and intelligible way to apply them to your combats that don't mire everything down. Now let's look at some armor. Okay, let's say this cleric. Let's say this fighter has. Let's just say he's a guard, right? And he has studded leather armor, which is going to give him an AC of 7. He's got a short sword and he's got a small shield, right? Now this cleric has no armor. Let's see what happens. Okay, the fighter is going to win 88% of the time. Okay, now this is a guard. Okay, who's a level 1 fighter, so he's not a normal 0 level human guard, right? He's got studded leather and he's got a small shield and he has a short sword, which should be a much more potent weapon, generally speaking, than a club. And the cleric still has an opportunity to win this combat completely unarmored about 11% of the time. I wonder what happens if we take away weapon versus armor class and weapon speed factors for that matter. Okay, if we take away weapon versus armor class and weapon speed factors, that cleric now has a 20% chance. So twice the chance to kill this armed guard. Okay, so that's a plain example to me that it takes away from the fighter as a character class. And this is why, a lot of the reason I think that newer players and stuff like that don't play fighters. Fighters are boring. Fighters can't blah, 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 blah. Well, yeah, it's because you've nerfed them. It's because you've neutered them and made them useless by not using the rules that were presented in the book from the very beginning. Okay, once again, to demonstrate this, and I apologize for just hammering on it, but this unarmored cleric beats this fighter with studded leather and a small shield, an AC of 6 versus 10, and a short sword 20% of the time. Unless you use weapon speed factors and weapon versus armor type. And then that percentage drops to 11%. If we arm this fighter with a longsword, okay, now the cleric only has a 7% chance. If we arm this fighter, say, with a bastard sword, cleric's got about a 9% chance. The fighter, because this is just using it one-handed, the fighter has about a 90% chance. Okay, and that's a hefty chance to kill that cleric, as well it should be. However, if we don't use this, then the chance for the cleric to kill the fighter rises to 12. And listen, I just don't see a cleric with no armor and a club, having much of a chance at all of killing an unequipped and armed fighter. Let's take it a step further. Let's give this fighter a little bit better armor, right? Let's give him chainmail. So we're gonna give him an armor type, because he has a shield, an armor type of 4. We're gonna go back and give him the short sword, and we're going to simulate this to see how close to 0% chance for the cleric we can get. We don't get 0% chance, right? The cleric has an 11% chance. Unarmored cleric has an 11% chance of killing this fighter with chainmail and a shield and a short sword. Okay, even though the fighter has 2 more hit points. Don't let that happen. Now, I mean, of course, stranger things have happened, and things are going to happen like that, but that shouldn't happen 1 out of 10 times. Apologies. So let's simulate it again. When we use weapon speed factors and weapon versus armor type, it happens about 1.5 times, 1.3 times, I guess, out of every 100. Okay, and there's a 1 in 100 chance that an unarmored cleric is going to roll up on a member of the city guard who's decked out in chainmail and a shield and has a short sword. There should be a 1.3% chance that cleric is going to prevail. Let's go ahead and give the cleric some armor. We are going to give him chainmail, okay, and we're going to give him a shield. We're going to put these guys on equal footing, right? Now, we've still got the club. Let's go ahead and get him something a little more formidable. Probably Footman's Mace, huh? Footman's Mace. Well, that does 2 through 7, right? So, I think any of those weapons are 2 through 7. I'm not sure that. Okay, so the Horseman's Mace is 1 through 6. All right, so let's go ahead and give him a Horseman's Mace and see what happens in this case. So these guys are a lot more even as far as armor and stuff is concerned. There's still a 2 hit point difference. Let's see what happens if they just duke it out without weapon speed factors and weapon versus armor type being applied. Okay, the fighter wins 60% of the time. Okay, these guys are the same. This fighter is winning 60% of the time, even though these weapons have the same amount of damage and everything else. This fighter's winning 60%, well, 59% of these combats, just because he has 2 more hit points than the cleric. Otherwise, all of these stats are the same. Now, what happens if we turn on weapon speed factors? I don't expect that much is going to happen there. It actually did, and that would be because the Horseman's Mace has a speed factor of 6, and the short sword has a speed factor of 3. So in order for this cleric to use this Horseman's Mace in squaring up against this fighter, he has to make a sacrifice. If we're using weapon speed factors, the sacrifice is he has to allow that fighter to attack him twice to his 1 in all tied initiatives. And in this case, that sacrifice is a pretty big deal for the cleric, because there were 21,438 times that the cleric died because of that. Now, maybe that offsets. Maybe that offsets with weapon versus armor type, right? So this is a mace, which is pretty good weapon, generally speaking, at least from a historical perspective, without digging into that table again. From a historical perspective, the mace is a pretty good weapon versus all armor types, because it's bludgeoning. It's going to dent your plate mail. It's going to I don't know that chainmail is going to have. I'm not medieval armor historian, so as my buddy Bill says, don't at me, right? But you can actually at me. But let's turn on weapon versus armor type and see what happens here. Now, if we turn on weapon versus armor type, the cleric's sacrifice in dying more often makes a lot more sense. Right, he's allowing himself to be attacked twice by this short sword because it's a faster weapon. But now his horseman's mace, as a bludgeoning weapon, is capable of being much more effective against the chainmail. So now this has considerably increased his chances of winning the combat. Okay, now the fighter only wins 55% of the time. What if we make this a footman's mace? I don't know offhand that there's a meaningful difference between the two, other than the footman's mace doing 1d6 plus 1 point of damage. So there's an additional point of damage, which might make up for the loss of a hit point there. So if we do that, we can see that now the cleric, he's not sacrificing 2 attacks to his 1. Now the cleric actually wins this combat 54% of the time. So as we can see, weapon speed factor, weapon versus armor type in this particular case is a huge consideration, and it actually allows for combatants who would otherwise have no hope in combat the ability to make a difference at least some of the time. If we give, let's give this guy a short sword to get closer. So the cleric's got 2 through 7 damage. The fighter, he's got a long sword. We're dealing with a speed factor of 5 here. I think a speed factor of 7 on the mace. This is just chainmail. And now the fighter wins 57% of the time because he's changed his weapon. Okay. If we don't use these things, fighter wins 58% of the time. It's about the same. Okay. And that's largely because the fighters, I would expect that longsword versus chainmail is probably 0. Every time I say that I would expect something, though, I'm wrong. So longsword versus AC type 4 indeed is 0. Now, let's say that we move on to some other armor, right? Let's say that this cleric has splint mail. Okay, this cleric has splint mail. Now, if he didn't have a shield, he would have an AC of 4, and this would be AC type 4. Okay, but we're going to give him a shield. This is going to make him AC type 3. We're going to also give the fighter splint mail and a shield and make him AC type 3. So now the things separating them are the weapon. Longsword's capable of doing an additional point at the upper end of the range, and the cleric has 2 fewer hit points. Let's see how this works out with nothing here. So fighter wins 58% of the time. Okay, without factoring in weapon speed factors and weapon versus armor type. If we do factor those in, the cleric wins a full 61% of the time. So as we can see, that's a significant difference, and it's a difference that we need to consider. Okay, whether or not you use it, I think it's important that you know what it's capable of and what it does before you decide not to use it. Now, there's going to be plenty of people who aren't going to watch this and who aren't going to care about any of this. They're already set in this with their ways and all of that. But I'm talking to people who aren't sure whether they're on the fence with this stuff, or people who have never really delved into the complexities of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, specifically with the rules as they're written. And maybe I'll change some minds, but I know I'm not changing my mind. This is the bare minimum of the complexity that I allow in my games, and there are ways to make this easy to apply and really straightforward, so that you and your players can run the game in a smooth and consistent way. All right, everybody. So I would say that about covers it. I tried to go through everything that I could think of at the time. I'm sure I missed something. As is usual, I made the video much longer than I intended. I'll put chapters in it, And thinking about it, what I may do is break out each of these things individually and put them in separate playlists so that you can refer back to them, as well as some of the other things that I want to do, such as making the simulation software available to everyone and making the document that describes this stuff likewise available to anyone. If, for anybody who's made it this far or even skipped ahead to this part, or anybody who's watched any of this, I appreciate it tremendously, and you guys are why I do it. I think for the next video, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about why I suspect, or the reason that I believe a lot of people don't use this stuff, and ways that we can make it a little bit easier to use, because I suspect that one of the reasons, or one of the primary reasons at least, is that people feel like it's too complex and too much math, too much looking up stuff in books and all that sort of thing, despite the richness that adds to the game. But there are ways that we can simplify this with some forethought and some changes in our processes. Additionally, I'll probably show in that next video, I'll probably show some alternative ways that people run combat, all of them legitimate in their own right, so that you can kind of see some of the differences in kind of house ruled systems and that type of stuff. Now, this video was very, very long. There's a lot of cuts in it, obviously, splices, whatever, and I apologize for that. I anticipated that I would be interrupted, but I was interrupted far more than I thought I would be, and a lot of times I'd interrupt opportune times. At least it's helped me a bit in my Premiere Pro workflow knowledge and learning some different things with transitions and that kind of stuff. So there's a good takeaway for me, and I really enjoyed putting this together. One thing I'd like to say is I obviously didn't cover every possibility with regard to simulations, and there's probably some stuff in here that's a little bit confusing. I don't rewatch through the whole thing, so I don't know specifically where I might have misspoke. If I didn't catch it while I was recording it, or during a quick sound check and that kind of stuff, then it might have escaped my attention. And if you see anything like that, leave a comment. And with regard to the combat simulator, if there's a specific scenario or group of scenarios that you'd like to see played out, just let me know in the comments, or hit me up over on X or wherever, and I'll put together a video going through some of those. If there's anything else you'd like to see, let me know. And I think that's all. Until next time, horns up.